You've got people, very smart people in very prestigious positions, making these decisions, thinking about these things, looking at the chessboard that is, the security complex inside of U.S. government, inside of nuclear power generation, and making sure that we put the right people, the right resources, and the right funding in the places that we need it so that we can protect these assets.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey everyone, Mike Witt here with Kontek Industries, and we are on episode 22 of Complacency Kills. And today we'll be talking about securing critical infrastructure and what that means and what's involved with it. So today we have myself, Mike Witt, and Pete Peterson. So Pete, if you want to introduce yourself to those that haven't met you before.
Hey, absolutely. Pete Peterson, retired Marine Raider, currently the National Account Manager for Critical Infrastructure here at Kontek Industries. Predominantly work in the markets for Department of Energy and nuclear power generation.
Awesome. Yeah, so here at Kontek, as you guys know, we do a lot of work with critical infrastructure, particularly within nuclear power facilities and Department of Energy facilities. But the critical infrastructure space is obviously it's a lot bigger than just those two markets, right? We have everything from your transportation sector, chemical sector, and the list kind of goes on from there. And really, the level of safeguards that's built into those sectors. Dependent on what's at stake, what assets they have, obviously the security postures kind of commensurate with what's
threat thresholds, drive resources and spending, right?
Yeah. So with that being said, I mean, can you kind of walk us through, you don't have to necessarily do all of them, but some of the major sectors within critical infrastructure and what what a typical security posture would look like, going from a substation all the way up to one of the highest performing nuclear plants in the country.
Yeah, I can chop it up a little bit. There's, depending on what website you go to or what government agency, there's a couple that overlap, but there's usually, I think the standard or what people talk about is about 16 different sectors inside of critical infrastructure. We can support all of them, but some of them don't require the physical security requirements that others do. The ones that I'll talk about today are going to be kind of more specific to what Kontek sees and what we deal with for the most part. And like you said, smaller to higher end physical security requirements. So you've got the power substations, which, right now aren't, I don't want to say they're not very well protected, but they have fences. They're there more to keep people out than actually physically stop folks, right? Chain link fence, a gate, maybe some guardrails, some signage, not much more than that. We have the ability to provide blocks, and a mixture of delay features related to physical security type of fencing or fence panels that really do mitigate the ability for you to, make entry into some of these substations. They are moving towards those types of higher echelon or more physical deterrence than what they currently have. So that's what we're seeing across power distribution. Then you can move into I would say lower end or lower threat threshold government facilities. We may have portions of military facilities that are satellite to larger bases that don't require the same physical security that maybe certain secure areas do on base. Where you're storing munitions, you're going to want a larger, more robust fence, surveillance systems, intrusion detection potentially, whereas maybe the outline or perimeter fence, you're going to have roving patrol that supports, the physical security deterrence, which is your fence and gates. And then you have a gate guard or sentry system that allows you to kind of observe and control access in and out of the site, along with some surveillance and IDS, depending on, where you're at a minimum, maybe at the entry and exit points. And then moving into what I would consider, and I just tried to lump these into kind of high or low, medium, high, as far as, the threat thresholds. And then you have, like special nuclear material production facilities or category 1 facilities or Department of Energy facilities where they're working on or constructing or storing nuclear weapon systems, similar to maybe an Air Force base that has those same assets. Sure. Those require a higher threshold or a higher threat threshold. And they have to be able to defend against something that's a little more significant because the criminal or adversary threat is balanced also against, I didn't mention this earlier, the higher consequence, right? Somebody breaks into certain facilities, there's nothing for them to really take other than material assets that can be recovered through insurance, or it's theft, people are going to resell them. Right. There's no direct damage to the public, where special nuclear material, nuclear weapon systems, weapons components, or nuclear power generation, some of the chemicals and other things that are on site could have significant consequence, out in the public, or be deemed, harmful to the public if not transported correctly or used, by a criminal threat or an adversarial threat. So those back to the DOE facilities or maybe special nuclear material Category 1 type facilities, they're going to have a large owner-controlled area, an OCA, kind of a space leading up to where the perimeter fence is. Then you have the fencing, maybe some block systems, a serpentine, an entry control point. That control point's going to have obviously physical security, sentries, response force capability. They're going to have signage along with, I think I mentioned intrusion detection and surveillance capability. And then there's also going to be along that perimeter surveillance capability. And then once you get inside, there'll be a lot of, tactics, techniques, and procedures and access control features, badging, check-in if you're not from the site, and a variety of other physical deterrents on your way into what we'll control maybe more controlled areas, right? Or protected areas where there's material being stored or hazardous or harmful to the public type material that requires special access or special clothing, whatever it is. They're going to create delays and mitigation features inside of that to make sure that they don't allow, both regular people on site from accidentally getting into these spaces or someone who has, a criminal is a criminal threat or an adversarial threat, allowing them to have access to it too. So they want to deny visibility as well as physical mitigation through fencing and delay features like blocks and intrusion detection.
Yeah. So like one of the big delineators I feel like is between these sectors that is kind of the crossing threshold for low, we'll call low to medium security up to high standard of security, is having personnel physically there, and then even one step further, which is having armed responders that are there. So, something that we see right now, kind of moving potentially into the power distribution space, is having more armed and unarmed personnel actually stationed at a lot of these, larger substations and that sort of thing. So, do you have any thoughts on if and when and how that's going to occur?
I think, we have a government agency for everything in the United States, which is good. They've got, some oversight, and they can take trends and translate that into policy, procedure, and or legislation if it's required. And so NERC and FERC, which are, essentially some of the convening authorities over those types of things and drive, some of the physical security requirements. I understand that they're definitively doing a review, as we speak, based on, the threat having increased. We've had a lot of attacks, substations specifically, over the last several years and in the last 2 decades, quite frankly, that have really brought a significant amount of attention to the power distribution sites not being as secure as they probably need to be. It's unfortunate, but the reality is the threat has changed and people are taking advantage of the information that's available open source on the internet, and they're able to kind of generally figure out how to defeat certain things or disrupt certain parts of civilian society through things like taking out critical components of a power substation that then creates a lot of issues for state and local government, even the federal government, costs a lot of money and time. And depending on what your intent is, criminal or adversarial or, whatever, it doesn't matter. You're still interfering with, people's lives and costing the state and these power providers a significant amount of money. And we don't want our infrastructure having that type of critical vulnerability. So now that's been identified, I think there's a lot of energy and effort in the security industry to kind of figure out what the next steps are to make it, meet the threat and mitigate it. But also, look to the future and be progressive in, hey, we put these things in place now. There's a cost associated with it. There's a significant amount of effort and energy that's going to get put into this. Let's, make sure that it's worthwhile. So I do think by the end of the year, early next year, we're going to start seeing some changes to the physical security requirements across power distribution sites, depending on their assessment, right? There's some that are small that aren't going to have a huge impact on the grid. There's others that are much larger or even smaller, but they're a critical piece of a much larger part of the national grid. And so based on those assessments, which are occurring, I think now and have occurred previously and are shelved, they're going to be reviewing all that information and making determinations on what they need to protect, how they need to protect it, and when the implementation of that protection will occur.
Right. And kind of going in that direction, one of the questions I have is, we see a common thread of, especially in the security space, especially in the pretty much anything outside of law enforcement to an extent and DoD is security or physical, especially physical security is something that's like it's often put to the wayside and is very reactionary based.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any utilities in the critical infrastructure space that kind of go above and beyond what in terms of, because my experience working in this industry has been that it's very just pushed by regulation. If it's not regulated, they're not going to invest. But I'm just curious. Have you had any experience with any groups or entities that you've worked with in your previous life that would step up and go above and beyond? And how do we change that?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And I think really across nuclear power generation, it just depends on the fleet. You've got larger fleets that have diversified energy. They're doing, a couple different things, not just nuclear. And they have the ability to kind of flex at a corporate level funding to support larger scale projects more frequently that allow for, I would say, a streamlined security process. And by that, I mean, they have the ability to go, all right, all of our sites are going to have this fencing, these types of entry control points, these types of cameras, and they can kind of either systematically or across the entire fleet project that vision and then actually have it come to fruition, right? And so larger entities in the nuclear industry I've seen definitely act more proactive, or they're very well versed. They understand that, hey, this is going to be regulation soon, or this is going to be policy. You look at pre 9/11, you look at post 9/11. The nuclear industry is a great example of what's changed in the physical security environment, over the course of 20 years. Where they're at now and where they were then, they're much more capable and able to both progressively look forward and go, all right, this is a threat that's probably coming and is imminent and proactive, versus pre 9/11 where it was whatever the minimum, or bare minimum is, that's all that we're required to do, because there was really no metric or previous threat that was beyond criminal that they had to really worry about. Yes, nuclear material, used nuclear material, fuel rods, they've always been a concern, but there's always been security on those, both physical and observation surveillance, as well as response force capability. So the U.S. government's been good at legislating that from that perspective. But in general, all of these sites are much more secure than they were. Not saying that they weren't pre 9/11, they're just better now. It's like anything else, right? You want to be progressive. So they're a good example of that. In other industries, or other entities or organizations like the DOE enterprise or the federal government, they're like a ship sometimes. Sometimes the smaller ships in the Navy can move and are, they can make a 90-degree turn much easier than an aircraft carrier. And so when they're coming around, that's a 2-mile turn for certain organizations. So something large like the DOE may have the funding to implement something, but it may take several years to get it across the entire enterprise. Same with the federal government. So I would say that they're good at following the regulation, good at legislating it, implementing it really, to your point and to the question, really just depends on, I think, the desire. Security, it's not so much that it's an afterthought. It's not profit generating. In the U.S. government, it's taxpayer dollars that drive spending. So, and the threat is usually higher, right? They're producing nuclear weapons, protecting nuclear weapons. Those things require security. We understand that. There's a huge threat if they were to get into the public domain. There's a lot of effort and energy to regulate that, which nuclear power generation, nobody wants a radiological release, but there's a lot of control features. And it would take a significantly sophisticated criminal or adversarial threat to do that. So they always try to balance the realities of the threat, and make them parallel to what they're actually doing, right? I.e., you see fences that are taller or shorter based on what they think the criminal or adversarial threat is. But yes, I think that there is movement for some industries and some organizations, and some are slower based on, if you're a smaller, single reactor plant, you may not be as quick or have the same desire to spend your money in that way unless regulated to do so, and vice versa inside DOE. Some of the sites that aren't as critical to the weapons complex may not get the priority. And there's nothing wrong with that. You've got people, very smart people in very prestigious positions, making these decisions, thinking about these things, looking at the chessboard that is, the security complex inside a U.S. government, inside of nuclear power generation, and making sure that we put the right people, the right resources, and the right funding in the places that we need it so that we can protect these assets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess my point with all that is that, especially for these certain sectors within critical infrastructure, is that, it took a 9/11 to kind of implement in a reactionary fashion. So I would just, I think the general American public, like, we don't want to have to rely on another catastrophic event to impact things in power distribution or water distribution and things of that nature. So, it's just always an interesting conversation is how do we get out of the cyclical reactionary method when it comes to security? And I don't know if there's a good answer for it other than having a lot of buy-in from your entire, organization and doing your own risk analysis of what's at stake.
I like to think, I should say I like to think, based on my experience both in the military and since I've retired, there's a lot of smart people in a lot of good positions that they're responsible for making these assessments. Nothing's perfect. We had a lot of failings, since this country has started to right now, but we've also got a lot of successes, right, for every failure. So you've got to measure, you know what you do the best that you can in the moment that you're in with the resources that you have. And I think for the industries that we serve, I see a lot of that regularly. People with good intentions using the resources that they have available to make the best decisions. But you're right. And I think this is widespread across a variety of industries. This is not just in the United States. This is international in scope. It's very easy to respond after something's happened and have the funding and resources and education pushed after the fact than sometimes it is, to sell, prior to. It's very hard to say, well, this is bad if it would happen. And then you've got all, people on one side. Well, it could, but did it? Do we have it? Is it been operationally executed, out in the world somewhere where we can say bad guys are doing this, or, has it happened here where we can reference something specific? Nuclear power plants haven't been attacked. They've had a few instances here and there with people, criminal activity or protesters, but they haven't had a directed, criminal or adversarial threat against a site since the inception of nuclear power generation. So it's sometimes hard to sell corporate leadership on it's a cost of doing business, versus, well, we can minimize this because we don't really need it. There's been nothing that states that this threat is as high as, the government and these legislative bodies and these governing bodies and regulatory bodies say they are. And the reality is nobody wants to be left holding holding the bag, of, oh, we could have put a fence up, but we didn't. And now we have a weapon system that's out in the public domain. Now we have, nuclear material that's giving, potentially could be used for radiological release. You want to make sure that those things are minimized and mitigated, and that access to those things is denied to the best level you can with the resources that you have based on the threat that you've been presented with.
For sure. Cool. Yeah. And, in the future, we'll be doing more podcasts and more information sharing on, again, going through both the overt and covert levels of physical security in and of itself, kind of separating that out between, fencing, guard booths, that sort of thing, over to the, the more, the cyber side, with surveillance and intrusion detection and that sort of thing. So we'll be doing more content in the future, but it's good to have you on, man.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
We'll catch you guys next month for episode 23.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye.